In January 2006, housing officers from the Metropolitan Housing Association in North London received a court order to enter apartment number 40 of the Sky City building, a residential complex located in Wood Green in the northern part of the British capital. The reason was technical, administrative. A tenant had not paid rent for more than 2 years. The legal proceedings had been lengthy, meticulous, bureaucratic. Nobody expected to find anything out of the ordinary. Perhaps an abandoned apartment, perhaps some furniture left behind. What they found, however, completely redefined the modern understanding of urban loneliness. When the door opened that winter day, the social workers and officers who entered the apartment were greeted by a penetrating, unmistakable smell. On a sofa, in front of a television that was still on, surrounded by unopened Christmas shopping bags and wrapped gifts that were never delivered, lay the skeletonized body of a woman. The apartment was practically intact. The heating had been running all that time. The television continued broadcasting. And Joyce Carol Vincent, 38 years old, had been dead on that sofa since sometime in December 2003. Almost 3 years, 1,000 days. In a city of millions of inhabitants, in a building full of neighbors, meters from shops, post offices, shopping centers, and public transport stations. Joyce Vincent had died alone, and nobody had noticed. This is not a murder case. There is no identifiable villain, no violent crime to solve, no conspiracy to unravel. This is a case about something far more disturbing: the possibility of completely vanishing in the midst of a crowd, of dying silently while the world continues spinning around your absence. This is the case of Joyce Vincent, and what it reveals about modern societies is more unsettling than any criminal mystery. Joyce Carol Vincent was born on October 19, 1965, in Hammersmith, London. She was the youngest of 5 sisters, daughter of Caribbean immigrants who had arrived in England during the decades of migration from the West Indies. Her mother died when Joyce was 11 years old, a traumatic event that would profoundly mark her emotional development. Her father, a man described as strict and emotionally distant, raised the girls in a disciplined but cold environment. The Vincent sisters grew up emotionally dispersing from one another, developing family bonds that, although existent, were never particularly close or constant. From a young age, Joyce proved to be a charming person. Those who knew her in her adolescence and youth consistently described her as radiant, sociable, attractive. She was approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall, had a wide and contagious smile, and possessed that indefinable quality that makes some people light up a room simply by entering. It wasn't just her physical appearance, which was certainly striking, but something more: her ability to connect, to make others feel special, to navigate conversations with grace and ease. During the 80s and 90s, Joyce worked in various administrative and secretarial jobs. She was employed at several prestigious companies in central London, including legal firms and corporate offices. Her colleagues remembered her as professional, punctual, always well-dressed. She had refined taste in fashion, bought quality clothes, applied makeup carefully. In photographs from that era, she always appears smiling, surrounded by friends, at parties, at concerts, at social events. Because Joyce had an active social life, even an enviable one. She regularly attended music concerts, particularly soul, jazz, and R&B. She personally met famous musicians, including Stevie Wonder, Gil Scott Heron and Betty Wright. She wasn't exactly a groupie, but she moved in circles where these connections were possible. She had multiple groups of friends, some from work, others from the London music scene, others from her various interests. She went out frequently, travelled occasionally, maintained correspondence. She was, by all external appearances, an urban, modern, connected woman. But beneath this social facade existed something more complex. Those who knew her more intimately noticed that Joyce rarely spoke about her family. She avoided deep conversations about her childhood. When asked about her mother, she changed the subject. When discussions about family relationships arose, she excused herself or redirected the conversation toward more superficial territories. Her friendships, although numerous, tended to be compartmentalized. One friend might not know of another's existence. Joyce kept people in separate orbits around her life, rarely allowing those worlds to cross. There was also a pattern in her romantic relationships. Joyce had several boyfriends over the years, but these relationships tended to be tumultuous. There were episodes of domestic violence, although the specific details were never completely clear. On at least one occasion, her friends noticed bruises that Joyce explained evasively. On another, she disappeared for several days without giving explanations, reappearing as if nothing had happened. When she finally ended these relationships, she did so abruptly, cutting off all contact not only with the partner, but also frequently with the shared friends from that period. In the mid-90s, Joyce began working for Ernst & Young, one of the most prestigious auditing firms in the world. It was a good job, well paid, with benefits. But it was also during this period that some colleagues began to notice subtle changes. Joyce occasionally missed work without prior notice. When she returned, she offered vague explanations. Personal problems, family matters, nothing specific. Her work performance was not significantly affected, but her presence became less reliable. It was also during this time that Joyce suffered a peptic hemorrhage, a bleeding ulcer in the stomach that required hospitalization. Stress is a known factor in the development of these conditions. She spent time at North Middlesex Hospital recovering. Some friends visited her, but others learned of the event only weeks later, when Joyce casually mentioned having been ill. This tendency to minimize personal crises, to not ask for help even in serious situations, was characteristic of how Joyce handled difficulties. In the late 90s, Joyce left her job at Ernst & Young. The exact circumstances are not completely clear. Some friends remembered that she mentioned wanting a change, looking for something different. Others suggested there had been problems at work, although nobody could specify what kind of problems. And what was clear was that after leaving that stable and well-paid job, Joyce's life began a downward trajectory. She worked temporarily in other offices, less prestigious secretarial jobs, short-term contracts. Her financial situation gradually deteriorated. She moved several times, each apartment slightly smaller, in neighborhoods slightly less desirable. She still maintained her careful appearance, her smile, her superficial charm. But those who knew her well began to notice something more. A fatigue in the eyes, a growing tendency to cancel plans, periods of silence where before there had been constant communication. Her sisters, with whom she had never had particularly close relationships, became even more distant. There were occasional disputes, misunderstandings that were never fully resolved. Joyce attended family gatherings less and less. By the year 2000, She had practically no regular contact with any family member. When one of her nephews got married, Joyce did not attend the wedding. She offered no explanations, simply did not appear. Her friends also began to experience this growing distance. Joyce might disappear for weeks, then reappear with vague explanations, or no explanation at all. When someone called her, sometimes she responded with enthusiasm, promising to meet soon. Other times, she simply didn't return calls. Gradually, imperceptibly, the circle of people who maintained active contact with Joyce kept shrinking. In 2001, Joyce's situation had reached a critical point. Her housing situation was unstable. She had had problems with violent boyfriends, and at some point, although the precise details are not publicly documented, she sought help from social services. She was classified as vulnerable and assigned an apartment in Sky City, a social housing complex in Wood Green. Wood Green is a neighborhood in North London, part of the Haringey district. It is not the most prosperous area of the city, but neither the most disadvantaged. It is a working-class, multicultural, bustling neighborhood. The main street, known as Wood Green High Road, is full of shops, markets, ethnic food restaurants, betting offices, second-hand stores. The Mall Wood Green Shopping Center is one of the central points of the area, always full of shoppers. The streets are constantly busy. Buses pass every few minutes. Wood Green Tube Station connects the neighborhood with the rest of London through the Piccadilly line. Sky City, where Joyce moved, was a social housing building managed by the Metropolitan Housing Trust Association. It was not an old or deteriorated building, but a relatively modern residential complex, built with the intention of providing affordable housing to people in vulnerable situations or with low incomes. The building had multiple floors, with mainly small one-bedroom apartments. There were other tenants, families, individuals, people coming and going daily. There were common stairways, shared areas, regular maintenance services. Joyce's apartment was small but functional. It had a living room, an integrated kitchen, a bathroom and a bedroom. Windows facing the street. Thin walls that occasionally allowed hearing neighbors. It was the type of apartment where one's life is not completely isolated from the outside world, where the sounds of the city constantly penetrate, reminding you that you are surrounded by millions of people. Initially, when Joyce moved to Sky City in 2001, there was some contact with social workers. As someone who had been classified as vulnerable, there were occasional check-ins, forms to complete, appointments to keep. But Joyce was an adult, capable, showed no evident signs of severe mental illness or physical incapacity. She was not someone who required constant supervision. And gradually, as the months passed, these contacts became less frequent, then sporadic, then non-existent. During 2002 and early 2003, Joyce continued living in that apartment. She worked occasionally, temporary jobs when she could get them. She went out to buy groceries, paid some bills, maintained a minimal existence. Some neighbors saw her occasionally in the hallways, on the stairs. An attractive woman, always well-dressed, who greeted politely, but did not initiate conversations. In a city like London, particularly in social housing complexes, where residents change frequently and privacy is valued, this absence of deep interaction was not unusual. Her friends, those who remained, noticed that Joyce became increasingly difficult to contact. Her mobile phone was sometimes off for days. When she finally responded, she sounded distracted, distant. She promised to meet, then cancelled at the last moment, or simply didn't show up. Some friends interpreted this as Joyce wanting space, going through a difficult phase that she would eventually overcome. Others, concerned, tried to visit her, but Joyce rarely gave her exact address or found excuses not to receive visitors. Martin, a former boyfriend who had maintained a friendship with Joyce, tried to maintain contact during this period. He called her regularly, genuinely cared about her well-being. Joyce sometimes responded with affection, other times with irritation. In one of their last conversations, recorded in Martin's memory, but not documented with an exact date, Joyce casually mentioned that she wasn't feeling well, that she had unspecified health problems. Martin offered help. Joyce declined, assuring him that everything was under control. Another friend, whose name later appeared in the documentary Dreams of a Life, directed by Carol Morley, remembered seeing Joyce sometime in 2003. They were at a tube station, a casual encounter. They talked briefly. Joyce seemed hurried, perhaps nervous. She said she was fine, that she was in a hurry. They said goodbye with a quick hug. It was the last time that friend saw Joyce alive. During the autumn of 2003, Joyce's phone calls ceased completely. The few friends who still maintained contact left voicemail messages that were never returned. They sent text messages that remained unanswered. Some assumed that Joyce had changed her number. Others thought she had finally decided to cut ties completely, something she had done before with other groups of friends. Nobody reported her disappearance to the police. In a city of millions, where people are constantly moving, changing jobs, relocating, reinventing their lives, the absence of news from someone does not necessarily trigger immediate alarms. Her sisters, with whom Joyce no longer had regular contact, did not notice her silence, because silence was already the norm. Months, sometimes years, had passed without speaking to Joyce previously. Her absence from family events was not new. When they tried to contact her and received no response, they assumed Joyce was busy, angry about some past dispute, or simply keeping away as was her custom. At her workplace, or more precisely at the temporary employment agency that occasionally got her jobs, she simply stopped showing up. They tried to contact her a few times, then assumed she had found employment elsewhere, or was no longer interested in working with them. In the temporary employment sector, where workers come and go constantly, this was not unusual. Meanwhile, in apartment 40 of Sky City, something had happened. At some point in December 2003, probably mid-month based on the state of the body when it was finally discovered, Joyce Vincent died. The exact cause of death was never determined with certainty due to the advanced state of decomposition of the body. The forensic examination was unable to identify a specific cause. There was no evidence of violent trauma, no signs of struggle, no indications that another person had been present. The possibilities included complications from her pre-existing peptic ulcer, a heart attack, a stroke, or some other acute medical condition. What was clear was that it had been sudden, or at least sufficiently quick, that Joyce did not have a chance to seek help. When she died, Joyce was in her living room. She was wrapped in winter clothing, as if she had been feeling cold. And near her were shopping bags containing wrapped Christmas gifts, never delivered. The television was on. Some reports mentioned that she might have been wrapping gifts when she died, although this is speculation based on the scene. What is not speculation is that Joyce died alone, with nobody to notice, nobody to call an ambulance, nobody to hold her hand. And then began the deepest silence. The apartment, with its dead tenant, simply continued existing. The heating was connected and running, maintaining a constant temperature that accelerated decomposition. The television remained on, broadcasting programs that nobody watched, perhaps until finally the bulb burned out or the system broke down. Utility bills kept arriving, accumulating unopened. Rent stopped being paid, but legal procedures for eviction in the United Kingdom are slow, particularly when it comes to social housing. The closest neighbors, those who shared walls with Joyce's apartment, later reported having noticed an unpleasant smell at some point. However, they attributed this to uncollected garbage, plumbing problems, or spoiled food somewhere in the building. In housing complexes where multiple families live in close proximity, strange smells are not completely unusual. Someone perhaps reported the smell to maintenance, but not with enough urgency to provoke an immediate investigation. Others simply ignored it, assuming it would eventually disappear. Nobody knocked on Joyce's door. There were no postal deliveries requiring signature. There were no friends who insisted on visiting her. Her family did not know exactly where she lived, and if they knew, they were not in regular contact anyway. The social workers who had initially been assigned to her case had closed her file, considering that Joyce no longer required active supervision. Weeks passed. December became January 2004. The Christmas gifts that Joyce had bought remained wrapped. The new year arrived without celebration in that silent apartment. Joyce had entered 2004 dead, and the world continued spinning without noticing. Months passed. Winter transformed into spring. Bills continued accumulating. Correspondence piled up behind the door. Unpaid rent reached increasingly larger amounts. At some point, probably several months after Joyce's death, the Metropolitan Housing Association began formal procedures to recover the apartment due to non-payment. But these processes are bureaucratic, slow, require multiple legal notices, waiting periods, court orders. It is not possible to simply enter someone's dwelling, even if they are not paying rent. The summer of 2004 arrived. Joyce had been dead for more than 6 months. Her body, initially preserved by the constant heating, but eventually decomposing under accelerated conditions, began the process of skeletonization. Soft tissues deteriorated. Bodily fluids were gradually absorbed by the sofa where she had fallen. The apartment, sealed, with closed windows, became a macabre time capsule. Autumn arrived again, a full year since Joyce's death. Neighbors came and went, some moved out, new residents arrived. Life in Sky City continued its normal rhythm. Children played in the hallways. Couples argued through thin walls. Elderly people slowly climbed the stairs. And in apartment 40, Joyce remained, forgotten. During 2005, legal proceedings continued their slow course. Notices were sent to the apartment, naturally without response. Attempts to contact Joyce through registered phone numbers proved fruitless. The phone line of her apartment had probably been disconnected for non-payment. Housing officials meticulously noted each step of the process, complying with all legal requirements before being able to obtain a possession order. It is important to understand that during all this time, multiple systems that supposedly exist to prevent exactly this type of situation failed simultaneously, or simply were never activated. The health system had no record that Joyce had disappeared, because she was not under regular medical treatment at that time. The social services system had closed her case, considering her sufficiently stable as to not require follow-up. The housing system was following eviction procedures for non-payment, but these procedures do not include welfare checks. The police system was never alerted because nobody reported a missing person. Her potential employers assumed she had found work elsewhere. Her friends assumed she had decided to distance herself. Her family assumed she was fine, but without desire for contact. Christmas 2005 arrived, 2 years since Joyce's death. 2 Christmases that she had missed, surrounded by the gifts she had bought for that first Christmas that never came to celebrate. Outside the apartment, London shone with Christmas lights. Wood Green was decorated. Shops were full of shoppers. Families were gathering. And Joyce lay silent. Finally, in January 2006, after completing all necessary legal procedures, when the Metropolitan Housing Association obtained a court order to recover the apartment, a date was scheduled for forced entry. It was not an emergency. It was simply a routine administrative procedure. Housing officers, possibly accompanied by a locksmith, and perhaps a police officer, as is protocol in these cases, headed to apartment 40. The exact date varies according to sources, but it was in late January 2006. It was an ordinary London winter day, probably grey, cold, damp. The officials climbed the stairs or took the elevator to the corresponding floor. They approached the door of apartment 40. They knocked as a courtesy, although they did not expect a response. There was none. They prepared the tools to open the lock. When the door opened, the smell was immediately evident, overwhelming. Oh, it was not the strong smell of recent decomposition, but something drier, moldier, penetrating. The men entered cautiously. The apartment was in semi-darkness, curtains possibly closed. There was mail accumulated behind the door, so much that it had made opening difficult. As eyes adjusted to the dim light, the scene became clear. In the living room, in front of a television, on a sofa, there were human remains. It was not immediately recognizable as a complete body, due to the state of advanced decomposition. It was mainly skeletal, with some mummified tissues adhering to the bones. The clothing the person had been wearing was still visible, providing contour to the form. Shopping bags were nearby, still wrapped gifts visible. Police were called immediately. The scene was cordoned off. A forensic investigation began. Investigators meticulously documented every detail of the apartment. Photographs were taken from multiple angles. Temperature was measured. The state of appliances was noted. Correspondence was collected and examined to establish identity and chronology. Identifying the body was not immediate due to its state, but the correspondence in the apartment provided a name: Joyce Carol Vincent. Dental records were eventually used to confirm identification definitively, but establishing when she had died was more complicated. The state of decomposition suggested a prolonged period, but exactly how long? Forensic investigators examined multiple factors. The state of the body suggested years rather than months. The correspondence provided clues. The last dated letters were from December 2003. There was nothing after that date that had been opened. The wrapped Christmas gifts suggested that death had occurred near that season. Analysis of stomach contents and other forensic methods were impossible due to the state of the body. Finally, based on all available factors, forensic experts estimated that Joyce had died sometime in December 2003, although the exact date could never be determined. This meant she had been dead approximately 2 years and 1 month. More than 750 days. In an inhabited building, in a bustling city, meters from shops and transport stations, surrounded by millions of people, news of the discovery gradually filtered to the media. Initially, it was reported as a curious fact, almost anecdotal. Woman found dead after years. But as more details emerged, the story captured public imagination more deeply. It wasn't simply that she had died alone. It was that she had completely disappeared from collective consciousness, while still technically present. The media began investigating. Who was this woman? How was it possible that nobody had missed her? Journalists tried to contact her family. Her sisters, contacted by reporters, expressed shock and pain. Some admitted they had not been in close contact with Joyce for years. One sister mentioned that she had assumed Joyce was simply busy with her own life, that she would eventually get in touch when she wanted to. The pain in these statements was palpable, mixed with guilt, confusion, and the horrible realization that their sister had died alone years ago, without them knowing. Joyce's friends were also contacted. Martin, the ex-boyfriend who had tried to maintain contact, was devastated. He remembered their last conversations, and the unanswered calls, the voicemails left. He wondered if he should have done more, visited without invitation, insisted more aggressively. Other friends expressed similar feelings. All described Joyce as someone vibrant, full of life, someone who knew so many people, who was so sociable. How could someone like that end up dying completely alone and forgotten? The police investigation quickly determined there was no foul play. There was no evidence that another person had been involved in her death. There were no signs of forced entry, robbery, or violence. The death was classified as non-suspicious, although the exact cause remained undetermined due to the state of the body. An official investigation, known in the British system as an inquest, was opened to determine the circumstances of death. During this investigation, more details came to light. It was revealed that Joyce had been a victim of domestic violence in past relationships. Her medical history of peptic ulcer was confirmed. Her employment history, her multiple address changes, her growing social isolation were documented. Social workers who had been involved in her case were interviewed. They explained that Joyce had been classified as vulnerable initially, but that she had demonstrated being capable of living independently. There had been no signs of immediate risk that justified intensive, continuous supervision. Neighbors of Sky City were also interviewed. Some remembered having seen Joyce occasionally. They described her as polite, but distant. Nobody knew her well. Several mentioned the smell they had noticed at some point, but that they had attributed to other causes. One expressed guilt, wondering if they should have investigated more. Another defended their inaction, explaining that in London, in densely populated housing complexes, one learns not to intrude in others' affairs, to respect privacy. And here emerged one of the central questions of the case. Who can be blamed? The neighbors who smelled something strange but didn't investigate. The friends who stopped calling after months without response. The family that had allowed the relationship to deteriorate to the point of having no regular contact. The social workers who closed her case. The bureaucratic systems that moved papers but never verified the actual well-being of a human being. Or Joyce herself, who systematically pushed people away, maintained distances, rejected help. The uncomfortable truth was that nobody had done anything particularly wrong according to normal standards of modern urban behavior. Neighbors had respected privacy. Friends had interpreted silence as desire for space. Family had assumed absence of news as a sign that everything was reasonably well. Bureaucratic systems had followed established procedures. And yet, the result was that a woman died and remained dead for years without anyone noticing. The case of Joyce Vincent exposed fundamental fissures in the social fabric of modern cities. It revealed how it is possible to be surrounded by people and yet be completely isolated. It demonstrated that systems designed to protect the vulnerable have enormous gaps. It showed that human connections, without active and constant maintenance, fade with terrifying ease. London, unlike many megacities, operates on principles of protected anonymity. Privacy is valued, even sacralized. You are not expected to know your neighbors intimately. Urban friendships tend to be context-specific. Work friends, hobby friends, friends from different circles that rarely overlap. Families are geographically dispersed, maintaining contact through occasional phone calls or infrequent gatherings. This system allows freedom, self-determination, escape from oppressively closed communities. But it also creates conditions where someone can vanish without immediate alarm. Carol Morley, a British filmmaker, was fascinated and disturbed by the case of Joyce Vincent. She spent years researching, tracking down friends and acquaintances of Joyce, collecting photographs and memories. In 2011, she released a documentary titled Dreams of a Life, which attempted to reconstruct who Joyce had been, how she had lived, and how she had ended up dying in such loneliness. The documentary featured interviews with people who had known Joyce at different stages of her life. All shared memories of a charismatic, beautiful woman, full of life. The photographs showed Joyce smiling at parties, posing with friends, looking glamorous at social events. The interviewees visibly struggled with the cognitive dissonance between the Joyce they remembered and the fate she had suffered. Martin, the ex-boyfriend, appears in the documentary clearly tormented. He speaks of how he tried to maintain contact, of how he worried about her, but also of how he eventually accepted her silence as a sign that Joyce wanted to be alone. Other friends expressed similar regrets. All wondered what signs they had missed, what opportunities for intervention they had let pass. The documentary also explored hypotheses about why Joyce had become so isolated. Some suggested that her history of abusive relationships had made her distrustful, fearful of deep connections. Others mentioned the early death of her mother and the cold relationship with her father as formative factors that might have made it difficult for her to maintain healthy emotional bonds. There was speculation about depression, although there is no documented medical evidence of formal diagnosis. Some simply acknowledged that they didn't know, that Joyce had kept her internal struggles so privately that even those close to her only saw the charming surface. What the documentary made clear was that Joyce was not homeless, nor an addict, nor someone that society typically imagines when thinking about people who die alone and forgotten. She was educated, attractive, had a history of stable employment, had been social and connected. If it could happen to Joyce, it could happen to anyone. This realization was perhaps the most disturbing thing about the entire case. After the discovery of the body and the subsequent investigation, questions arose about what systemic changes might prevent similar tragedies. Should social housing services have stricter welfare check protocols? Should eviction procedures include earlier physical checks? Should systems exist to alert authorities when someone completely disappears from administrative systems like employment, healthcare, and bill payments simultaneously. Some jurisdictions in the United Kingdom began implementing improved protocols, more frequent checks on vulnerable tenants, early warning systems when multiple absence indicators coincide, public campaigns encouraging people to maintain contact with elderly or isolated neighbors. But these efforts face inherent limitations. In a society that values privacy and individual autonomy, there is resistance to overly intrusive surveillance systems, even when designed with protective intentions. Furthermore, the case of Joyce challenges simple systemic solutions, precisely because it involves so many intangible human factors. It wasn't just that systems failed, it was that human connections gradually eroded. Joyce actively maintained distance from others. Her friends and family, respecting what they interpreted as her wishes, eventually stopped insisting. Neighbors, following urban norms of non-intrusion, ignored ambiguous signs. No bureaucratic system can force people to maintain close relationships or to intervene in others' lives against established social norms. Joyce Vincent's funeral occurred in March 2006, more than 2 years after her actual death. It was a small ceremony, attended by some of her sisters and a handful of friends who had learned of her passing. There were no crowds, no elaborate celebration of a life, just a quiet and sad acknowledgement of an existence that had ended in loneliness years before. The media continued reporting on the case sporadically for years. It became a symbol, a parable about modern alienation. Opinion pieces reflected on what it meant that this could happen in a supposedly civilized and connected society. Essays explored themes of urban loneliness, social isolation, and the fragility of human support networks. The name Joyce Vincent became a shorthand reference for a particular type of contemporary tragedy, the person who disappears in plain sight. But beyond the symbolism, beyond the abstract lessons, remains the concrete reality of what happened to Joyce Carol Vincent. A 38-year-old woman with a life that had been full of people and experiences, died alone in a small apartment in North London. Her body remained there while seasons changed, while the world celebrated 2 Christmases, while millions of people passed through nearby streets completely unaware that someone lay dead meters away. Imagine those days, those weeks, those months, the absolute silence in that apartment, the television eventually turning off, the heating humming automatically, letters sliding under the door, accumulating in increasingly higher piles, dust gradually settling on all surfaces. The Christmas gifts, carefully wrapped, intended for people whose identities were never determined, remaining unopened. The neighbors on the other side of the wall, living their lives, unaware that they shared their space with death. Imagine Joyce's friends, sometime in 2004 or 2005, casually thinking about her, wondering how she was, perhaps considering calling her, then deciding against it because she had made clear she wanted distance. Imagine her sisters, busy with their own families and problems, occasionally remembering Joyce, but not with enough urgency to break the silence that had been established between them. Imagine the bureaucratic systems, processing paperwork, sending notices to an apartment where nobody could read them, following procedures with indifferent efficiency. All of this happened. It is not fiction. It is not exaggeration. It is the documented reality of what happened to Joyce Vincent. The case raises questions that have no easy answers. How do we measure the value of a life? By the number of people who attend your funeral, by how long it would take before your absence was noticed. In pre-modern societies, in small towns where everyone knows everyone, dying without being noticed for years would be virtually impossible. But we have built a different world, a world of individual freedom and protected anonymity. And Joyce Vincent demonstrated that in that world, it is possible to completely vanish. Was Joyce particularly isolated, or was she simply at the extreme end of a spectrum where many of us exist? How many unanswered calls does it take before we stop calling? How much time of silence is normal before it becomes concerning? In the modern era, where friendships are maintained through sporadic text messages and social media likes, how do we distinguish between someone who wants space and someone who is in crisis? These questions have no universal answers. They vary according to cultural contexts, social norms, and individual circumstances. But the case of Joyce Vincent forces us to confront them, to examine our own lives and relationships, to ask ourselves if we are truly connected or merely adjacent to other human beings. There are also dimensions of gender and race that deserve consideration. Joyce was a black woman in a society where black women frequently face particular social invisibility. Would her disappearance have been noticed more quickly if she had been white? If she had been a man? These are uncomfortable but necessary questions. Data on missing persons suggests that disappearances of black women receive less media attention and police resources compared to white women. Although Joyce was technically not reported missing, the principle of systemic invisibility may have contributed to her absence going unnoticed. Additionally, Joyce had been a victim of domestic violence, a factor that correlates with increased social isolation. Abuse victims are frequently separated from support networks by their abusers. Even after those relationships end, patterns of isolation can persist. Trauma can make it difficult to form new, healthy connections. Joyce may have been dealing with psychological consequences of abuse that contributed to her social withdrawal, although this is speculation without clinical confirmation. Her pre-existing health condition, the peptic ulcer, is also relevant. Chronic medical conditions can be physically and emotionally exhausting. They can limit the ability to maintain stable jobs and active social life. If Joyce was experiencing recurring symptoms or worsening of her condition, this could have contributed both to her isolation and potentially to her eventual death. But in the end, accumulating all these factors, gender, race, history of abuse, health problems, fragmented family, does not completely answer the central question: how could this happen? The answer, profoundly unsatisfying, is that it happened through the convergence of many small absences, none in itself criminal or even particularly negligent, but which together created a void where a person could disappear. Since the discovery of Joyce's body in 2006, there have been other similar cases discovered periodically. In Japan, the phenomenon is so recognized that it has a specific name: kodokushi, or lonely death. In that country, where population aging and social isolation are well-documented problems, it is estimated that tens of thousands of people die alone each year, with some bodies not being discovered for weeks or months. In response, commercial services have emerged, specializing in cleaning apartments after lonely deaths, and companies that offer regular checks on elderly people living alone. In the United Kingdom and other Western countries, Cases similar to Joyce Vincent's occasionally appear in the news. An elderly person found months after dying. A middle-aged person discovered when neighbors finally report persistent smells. Each case generates temporary shock, momentary reflection on urban loneliness, then gradually fades from public consciousness until the next case. Charitable organizations and community groups have attempted to address the problem of social isolation. Good neighbor programs encourage residents to get to know those living nearby. Telephone services offer regular calls to elderly or isolated people. Community centers organize social activities. But these efforts face significant challenges. They depend on volunteers, limited funds, and most importantly, on the voluntary participation of people who are isolated, who by definition are difficult to reach. Furthermore, there is a fundamental tension between preventive intervention and individual autonomy. In a liberal society, we cannot force people to participate socially, to accept help, or to allow supervision of their well-being. Joyce Vincent, when alive, had the right to live alone, to not answer calls, to distance herself from family and friends. She exercised that right. The tragic result does not negate the legitimacy of that fundamental right. This raises complex ethical dilemmas. At what point does concern for someone's well-being justify violating their privacy or autonomy? When someone stops answering calls for a month, 3 months, a year, who should have the authority to intervene? And how do we distinguish between someone who genuinely wants to be left alone and someone who is in danger but unable to seek help? There are no clear answers to these questions. Different societies draw these lines differently. In some cultures, extended family and close communities maintain constant, sometimes suffocating, supervision over individuals. In others, such as much of the modern urban Western world, individual autonomy is prioritized, with intervention reserved only for cases of clear and immediate danger. Joyce Vincent fell between these cracks. Joyce Vincent's legacy, if it can be called that, is complex. For some, she represents a warning about the dangers of social isolation. For others, she exposes systemic failures in how modern societies care for their vulnerable members. For still others, she is simply a personal tragedy, unique in her specific circumstances, but not necessarily indicative of broader social problems. What is undeniable is that her story resonates. It touches something deep in the contemporary psyche, a fear perhaps universally shared in the modern era. The possibility of not mattering, of disappearing without being noticed, of dying alone and being discovered only when administrative considerations, not human concern, finally lead someone to your door. This fear is not irrational. Data on loneliness is well established. In the United Kingdom, surveys have found that millions of people report feeling chronically lonely. The elderly are particularly vulnerable, but loneliness affects all age groups. Digital technology, paradoxically, can intensify loneliness by substituting deep interactions with superficial connections. Social media gives us the illusion of being connected while potentially deepening our isolation. Joyce Vincent, in her final years, lived in an era just before social media became ubiquitous. Facebook existed, but was not yet the cultural force it would become. Twitter was in its infancy. There was no Instagram, no WhatsApp. Communication depended more on phone calls and text messages. In a sense, it was even easier to disappear then than now, when the absence of social media activity might alert friends more quickly. But it is also possible that social media has made it easier to maintain the illusion of connection without real substance. We can have hundreds of friends on Facebook and still die alone. I discovered only when the smell finally becomes impossible to ignore. The quantity of connections does not guarantee quality, and quality of connections is what potentially prevents tragedies like Joyce's. Reflecting on the case almost 2 decades later, in 2026, the world has changed significantly since Joyce's death in 2003 and her discovery in 2006. Communication technologies have evolved. Awareness about mental health has increased. Discussions about loneliness are more prominent in public discourse. However, the fundamental problems that Joyce's case exposed remain unresolved. Cities continue growing, becoming denser, more anonymous. Families remain dispersed. Individualism continues to be valued. Social welfare systems face constant financial pressures. Norms of privacy and non-intrusion persist. In this context, cases like Joyce Vincent's, although rare, continue to be possible. What can we learn, then? Perhaps the most fundamental lesson is the fragility of human presence. We exist in the minds of others, in the relationships we maintain, in the systems that track us. When these connections break, we can vanish surprisingly quickly. Existence requires active maintenance, both from the individual outward and from the community inward. We might also learn humility about the limitations of systems and institutions. We cannot completely systematize human care. Bureaucracies can process cases, but cannot replace genuine concern. Regulations can establish procedures, but cannot force compassion. In the end, preventing tragedies like Joyce's depends on millions of small individual human decisions. Making that extra call, knocking on a neighbor's door, and insisting on seeing someone even when they say they're fine, maintaining connections even when it's inconvenient. But we must also recognize that we cannot save everyone, that some people resist help, that respect for autonomy sometimes means accepting decisions that make us uncomfortable, and that even with the best intentions and systems, tragedies will still occur. This acceptance is not defeatism, but realism. It allows us to focus on what we can do. Be attentive, be kind, check on those around us, build genuine communities where people are known and noticed. Joyce Vincent was a real person. She had dreams, hopes, fears, joys. She loved music. She had a beautiful smile. She met famous people and lived extraordinary moments. She also suffered traumas, faced health problems, struggled with difficult relationships, and gradually withdrew from the world. Her life was more than her death, but her death has become how she is remembered. Somewhere, there exist photographs of Joyce at parties, laughing, dancing, full of life. There exist people who loved her, who hold memories of shared conversations, moments of connection, meaningful experiences. Those versions of Joyce are as real as the Joyce who died alone in that apartment. But the image that persists in the public imagination is that of the body discovered years later, the unopened gifts, the television still on, the absolute loneliness of her ending. Perhaps that is the real tragedy, not just that she died alone, but that her death has eclipsed her life in collective memory. She has become symbol, parable, warning. In the process, the complex and real person who was Joyce Carol Vincent has been simplified, reduced to the data points of her isolation and death. Carol Morley's documentary attempted to counter this, to restore full humanity to Joyce by documenting who she had been when alive. The friends interviewed shared memories that painted a more complete portrait. A woman with presence, charisma, complexity. But even that documentary cannot completely escape the fact that we are looking backward through the lens of knowing her ending. Ultimately, the case of Joyce Vincent forces us to contemplate uncomfortable questions about how we live, how we relate to one another, and what happens when those relationships fail. It offers no easy resolution nor simple comfort. It is a mirror that reflects aspects of modern existence we would prefer not to see. In that apartment in Wood Green, for more than 2 years, a woman was dead while the world continued spinning. Nobody knocked on her door. Nobody insisted on seeing her. Nobody reported her disappearance. Systems processed paperwork. Neighbors respected privacy. Friends assumed intentional distance. Family maintained their established pattern of non-contact. And Joyce remained silent, forgotten, until finally administrative procedures, not human concern, led to her discovery. This happened. It happened in London, one of the largest and most connected cities in the world. It happened in 2003 and 2004 and 2005, not in some distant past, but in the modern era. It happened to a woman who had been social, known, loved, and it could happen again. The story of Joyce Vincent does not end with answers or solutions. It ends with questions that each of us must consider in our own lives. Who would you notice if they disappeared? Who would notice you if you disappeared? How fragile are your connections? How long would it take? These are questions we don't want to ask because the answers might be terrifying. But Joyce Vincent, in her silent and prolonged death, forces us to confront them. Her legacy, if we can call it that, is that uncomfortable reminder. In modern cities, surrounded by millions, absolute loneliness is possible. Total isolation is achievable. And disappearance, even in life, is within reach of any of us. May her memory serve not only as warning, but as a call to be attentive, to check on those around us, to maintain connections even when it's difficult, not to assume that silence means everything is fine. Joyce Vincent died alone, but her story, told now, can perhaps help prevent others from suffering the same fate. That is the small comfort, the tiny redemption in a story that otherwise lacks both. The silence in apartment 40 finally ended that day in January 2006. But the silence that allowed Joyce to live and die forgotten, that deeper silence that exists between people in modern cities, that continues. And it will continue unless we consciously decide to break it, one connection, one call, one visit at a time.